The wind carried a sound that wasn't quite a cry and not quite silence. Something in between, the kind of sound a soul makes when it's too tired to ask for mercy. The pasture stretched in shades of ash and frost. Grass flattened where hooves had once thundered with pride. Now, only two remained, a gray mare and a chestnut gelding, ribs sharp against their coats, eyes dulled by years of labor and neglect. They did not look up when the stranger approached. Perhaps they no longer believed footsteps could bring anything but pain. Elias Ward stopped at the edge of the fence. The boards were rotted, the rope frayed. He stood still long enough for the horses to breathe him in, the scent of rain, leather, and smoke. His hands were scarred but steady, the kind of hands that had built fences, buried friends, and learned that quiet can speak louder than pity. In his pocket lay a folded letter, soft from being read too many times. Find them. Free them if you can. He'd promised he would. Promises were the last things he still kept. He crossed the field with the slow certainty of a man returning to something he didn't know he'd missed. The horses flinched when the wind snapped his coat. He spoke softly, his voice low, like talking to ghosts. "Easy now," he said. "No one's here to break you." The mare flicked her ear just once, as though testing the shape of hope. The gelding's breath came out in mist, his sides trembling. Elias reached the post where they were tied. The rope had eaten into the wood, a cruel testament to endurance. He ran his fingers along it, then drew a knife from his belt, not fast, not sharp with anger, but deliberate. Each strand gave way with a sigh. When the last rope fell, the sound seemed to echo through the barren field. For a moment, nothing happened. The horses didn't move. Freedom, it seemed, was a language forgotten. Elias stepped back, giving them space. Snow began to fall, light, uncertain flakes drifting between them. The gray mare lifted her head first. Her eyes, clouded and cautious, met his. He didn't smile. He only lowered his gaze and whispered, "Don't owe anyone work anymore." The mare took one hesitant step forward. The gelding followed, pressing his muzzle against her flank. Together they stood beneath the falling snow, unbound but unsure. Elias looked past them toward the horizon where the land bled into mist. Somewhere beyond that line waited the life he hadn't planned to start again. He turned toward the road, shoulders heavy but unburdened in a new way. Behind him, a soft sound rose, the faint, fractured rhythm of hooves shifting against thawing earth. It wasn't running. Not yet, but it was something close. The barn stood at the end of a long dirt road, slouched against the wind, as if it had forgotten what it was built for. Elias led the horses through the gate with measured patience, their hooves dragging across the frozen ground. The gray mare limped slightly, but her head was higher now. The chestnut stayed close beside her, wary yet willing. They had followed him without rope, a quiet choice that felt almost like trust. Inside, the air smelled of hay and rain-soaked wood. The roof leaked in thin, silver lines. Elias hung his coat on a nail and set about preparing space, spreading straw, mending a broken latch, lighting the small oil lamp that painted the walls in amber light. The flame flickered against his face, softening the hard lines carved there by years of sun and loss. He didn't speak much, only hummed a tune under his breath, one that had no words anymore. The horses watched him with the stillness of creatures who'd learned silence the hard way. Their eyes followed each movement, how he moved slowly, never too close, never with the suddenness of command. When he placed a bucket of warm water between them, they hesitated before lowering their heads. The sound of drinking filled the barn, rhythmic and alive, like rain returning after drought. Elias found an old blanket tucked on a shelf, its edges frayed. He laid it over the mare's back, brushing away dust from her mane with his sleeve. Beneath his hand, she shivered once, then settled. He felt the tremor travel through her body to his own, a shared pulse of exhaustion and relief. "There now," he murmured, though she couldn't understand the words. "You're safe." Later, he sat on an overturned crate near the doorway, watching the horses eat. The storm outside deepened, rattling the boards. He opened the folded letter again, tracing the handwriting with a thumb roughened by years of labor. Find them. Free them if you can. The words had brought him here, but they no longer felt like someone else's task. They felt like absolution. He reached for a small wooden comb in his bag, the last thing he owned his wife. It had survived fires, miles, and silence. Now, in the amber light, he ran it through the mare's tangled mane. Each stroke loosened a snarl, and with it, something unspoken inside him. The horses leaned closer, slow, tentative, as if recognizing a ritual older than pain. When the lamp guttered, Elias rose to secure the shutters. The storm howled outside, but the barn stayed warm, the air thick with hay and quiet breathing. He stood a moment longer, hand resting on the doorframe, watching the two shapes in the glow. They were no longer just surviving. They were beginning. He whispered into the dark, almost to himself, "You'll learn to trust the light again." Spring arrived without fanfare, slipping quietly into the valley as if afraid to disturb what winter had mended. The fields beyond Elias's barn softened into green, the snow retreating in slow surrender. He opened the doors wide each morning, letting sunlight spill across the straw where the horses now stood stronger, their coats brushed to a muted sheen. The gray mare, whom he begun to call Mara, watched him with calm intelligence. The chestnut, Stone, nickered whenever he heard Elias's boots crunch outside. They had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his presence, and he to theirs. Elias rebuilt the broken fences plank by plank, the sound of his hammer echoing through the open air. With every board he set, the land began to look less like a graveyard and more like a promise. Sometimes, when the day grew long, he'd rest his arm on the fence and simply watch them graze. Their movement was slow, deliberate, as though they too were learning the shape of peace. A girl started appearing at the edge of the property, a thin figure in a blue coat, her satchel bumping against her side as she walked home from the schoolhouse down the road. She never crossed a gate, only lingered long enough to toss an apple or a few carrots toward the pasture. Elias pretended not to notice, though he always found the fruit gone by morning. Once, he caught her eye across the field. She smiled, quick and shy, before running off. Her presence felt like spring itself, quiet, uninvited, and somehow necessary. In the evenings, Elias wrote brief notes in his journal, not about the past, but about small things. How Mara no longer flinched when touched, how Stone had begun to trot again, how the sound of rain no longer felt like morning. He didn't realize he was recording his own recovery until he reread a page and found no mention of pain. One afternoon, under the tender gold of the setting sun, Elias took out the old letter from his pocket. Its edges had begun to tear, the ink faded but legible still. "Don't let them die in the dark. You're good with broken things, Eli. Maybe that's what saves you, too." He read the lines aloud, his voice unsteady but soft. The horses lifted their heads at the sound, ears flicking toward him as if the words carried weight beyond language. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the post where their ropes once hung. The same spot where he had found them dying now bore only sunlight and wind. For the first time in years, he felt something close to gratitude, not for what had been lost, but for what had survived. That night, as he closed the barn door, he heard a faint rustle from outside. The girls' laughter carried to the fading light. The horses stirred, restless and awake, as if sensing that the world beyond the fences was waiting for them again. By summer, the land had shed every trace of its former sorrow. The pasture shimmered under long afternoons, grass rippling in gentle waves. Mara and Stone roamed freely now, their bodies whole, their eyes bright. Elias often stood at the fence, hat tilted back, watching them move with quiet awe. What began as rescue had become something deeper, an unspoken covenant between the broken and the healed. The world had not changed, but his heart had found its rhythm again. The girl, Nora, came often now. She no longer lingered at a distance. She brushed the horses, her laughter threading through the hum of cicadas. Elias built her a small stool so she could reach Mara's mane, pretending it was for her comfort, though he liked seeing her belong here. The barn, once hollow, carried life again. Soft whinnies, the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of hay in summer air. It was a home, though none of them had called it that aloud. One evening, Elias found Nora sitting by the fence, tracing the scarred post where the ropes had once been. "They used to be tied here," she asked. He nodded. "They stayed because they were afraid of what waited beyond." She looked at him, her brow creased. "Are they still afraid?" He thought for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Not anymore." Later that night, he opened his journal beneath the low lantern glow. His writing had grown steadier. Shorter sentences, cleaner lines. "They don't need saving now. Maybe they never did. Maybe I did." He paused, listening to horses shifting in their stalls. The sound was steady, alive. He set his pen down and breathed in the scent of hay and rain-soaked earth. The following morning brought a visitor, a man in a weathered truck, bearing the mark of an animal rescue society. He'd heard stories of an old ranch hand who nursed dying workhorses back to life. We could list them under our sanctuary records. The man offered. They deserve recognition. Elias smiled faintly. They already have one. This is their place. He shook the man's hand, declining the clipboard. Some rescues, he thought, don't need a name. At dusk, he left the barn doors open. The light stretched far into the field, gold spilling over the horses' backs as they grazed. Nora sat cross-legged in the grass, humming softly while Mara nuzzled her sleeve. Stone raised his head toward the horizon, ears catching the faint music of wind through the trees. Elias leaned against the doorframe, eyes tracing the silhouettes against the fading sun. He whispered, almost as prayer, "You saved me too." Then he closed the journal, placing it beside the old comb and the worn letter. The lamp flickered once, steadying itself. Outside, laughter and hoofbeats mingled with the wind, carrying the quiet truth of all he had learned. Sometimes redemption begins with the simple act of opening a gate.